Hey Facebook, how you guys doing? Welcome to our weekly Dependent Independent Productions Facebook Live series where I talk about how to make podcast easier, where I give tips and tricks to help you either start your own podcast or make your own podcast better. Now, tonight on this episode, we're going to talk about content. And I want to thank you for joining me. If this is brand new, if you're checking me out on my Facebook page, thank you for joining me. This is a brand new adventure that I'm doing. And if you haven't seen our old episodes, make sure you go to our YouTube channel at the Dependent Independent Podcast YouTube page where you can watch all of our past episodes. This is episode 4. And again, we're going to talk about content. I did some research before I started this episode about what content is. Now, basically, in a nutshell, content is what you talk about on your podcast. Just like the content we're going to talk about on this Facebook Live is about finding content, but also differentiating your content. Content is basically what you put on your podcast, what you talk about. Now, before I started my podcast, the thing I really struggled with is even though I had a calling to get on a microphone and actually produce my own show, I needed to figure out what I wanted to talk about, but also what do I think other people wanted to listen to. And when you decide to pick your content, again, you can go on the web and you can find this content, that content. I think your best bet is just simply to start off with what do you like to talk about? What do you like? It's amazing how many podcasts there are out there where people can listen to virtually anything on the web and on your podcast player. You can listen to podcasts on milking goats. You can listen to podcasts on fishing. You can listen to podcasts on politics. You can listen to podcasts on true crimes. There is amazing plethora, at least since the time when I started doing my podcast, that the topics have gone complex, and they also have gone through waves too, where when I started listening to podcasts, it was about video games, and now it's about video game developers. It's amazing how it's evolved. But in order to start your own show, the first thing you should really decide on is what is the content? What do you want to talk about? And I think your best bet, first and foremost, before you turn on a microphone, is decide to talk about what you like to talk about. That's usually the thing that will come easy to you. Now, when I started my podcast, it was really about making connections and having fun and having a conversation. So I just kept it real simple. It's evolved since then, but I was committed on that was the content I wanted to create. Now, the one thing that I want to add to that is not simply that content is about what you want to talk about. And launching your first podcast, we talked about episode 0. And if you can do me a favor, the best thing about being on Facebook Live is I have a lot of people here, like my friend Lou, who tunes in every week. He's a podcaster as well. As Lou is doing his podcast, if you could do me a favor, any other podcasters tuning in, if you want to just for a hint to my audience on what type of content you produce, go ahead and put it in the comments, and I'll post it right here on the middle so everyone can see it. And especially if you're a podcaster, put the name of your podcast, and I'll put it right up here as well. And it'll stay up there as long as you watch the show, because you guys are great, and you guys have been supporting me as I'm trying this new venture. So content, you figure out what you want to talk about. Again, first when I first started, I thought it'd be easy just to talk about video games or talk about entertainment, because I was really into movies. And to be honest, there's tons of podcasters out there that already do that. So not only did I want to tell you that content, make it simple for you. Content is what you want to talk about on your show or on your podcast. The best thing you can do, I think, to sustain a podcast and talk about what you like to talk about is do something different. Basically, think differently to differentiate your content. What I mean is, as a creative, and I know this is a creative outlet for those of you that started a podcast, or you want to send a message to your audience, you want them to take something away from you, differentiating your content will make it more appealing to those audience members that want to listen to your show, that are interested in those types of things. So case in point, I was just talking to someone earlier. I was on a gentleman named Harry Duran. He's got a podcast called Podcast Junkies. Amazing podcast and entrepreneur. Hope to learn tons of stuff from him as we stay connected. And here I want to do this too, because Lou Hastings. And this is a little bit more about Lou. Lou hosts the Red Road Radio Show news, commentary and interviews about the challenges and successes in the Indian country. And one thing that I got to throw out to Lou is when I heard Lou speak at the Mid-Atlantic Podcast Conference last year, he did his presentation on content, but he really broke down about, he really gets involved in talking about the Native American culture. It's amazing what he does because I don't know any other podcaster that talks about that. So when I think of special and individual podcasts, Lou is the first person that comes to mind. But obviously, he differentiates himself from everybody else. Anybody can talk about anything in regards to culture and how people live. He specifically picks this niche. And his audience, he has a loyal audience that pays attention to him because he speaks to something that they love. Now, the thing is, when you decide to do a podcast and you pick your content, whether it be entertainment, true crimes, or whatever your content's going to be, and I can help you with that if you go to the dependentindependent.com, please leave your name, email address, and tell me why you want to start a podcast, and I can help you get there, find your voice. When you find your content, you can talk about video games, you can talk about pop culture, you can talk about movies, you can talk about virtually anything you want to talk about. But I guarantee you there's somebody else talking about the same thing. Somewhere in the podcast universe, someone is. So how to differentiate yourself? Just think differently about how you talk about it. So if you want to do a podcast about movies, you can simply talk about the last movie you saw, or you can do a podcast on you and your boyfriend or you and your husband or wife or significant other. Both of you get on the podcast and talk about how each of you viewed the movie on a date. I know there was a date movie podcast, Monday night date movie, movie night or date night movie podcast where a couple went out and they both did the podcast. So rather than just you talking individually, make it different. Make it something that your audience will go, you know what, I feel like tuning into an entertainment/movie podcast, but this one's really cool because it's different than everybody else. I even knew a movie podcast, and I usually use those because that's the podcast I used to listen to a lot. There was a movie podcast where it was called Movie Court. So they took an old movie, older movie, maybe, less than 5 to 10 years old. And there was a judge, and there was a defendant and a plaintiff. And the defendant brought up the movie, and they went back and forth. But the cool thing about it is not only did they talk about actors, producers, directors, everything about the movie, broke down the movie, but they did it in the vein of they were in a courtroom. And they approached the bench, and they did all this cool stuff that made the podcast way more interesting. And I tuned into it because even though I was getting movie content, I was getting in a different way. And to be honest, as a creative, any way you can differentiate your work than someone else will make it more special. Now, mind you, what I'm telling you right now, there's a million other podcasters out there that may absolutely disagree. You want to get out there, you want to get something that's accessible to the masses, increase your downloads, get something that's frequent, movies twice a week, podcasts twice a week. But I think a little differently. It's allowed me to sustain my content by differentiating it and making it special, but it is more of the long haul. If you're starting a podcast and you want it to gain popularity very, very quickly, you can jump on the mainstream. I definitely agree with you. You can do that. If you go to the iTunes application and you see on all the news and noteworthy of all the podcasts that are popular now or on your podcast app, what's trending, feel free to try that out. If that's what you want to do. But I believe in order to really make your mark in the podcast universe, you need to pick something that not only is content you're passionate about, something that means something to you. It's got to mean something to you before it means something to someone else. But also take your content and figure out a way to deliver that content in a different way. I want to recommend, before we stop this, and I know this is a really short video, because there's a lot more work you need to do if you are going to create a podcast on more of the heavy lifting is on you now, figuring out what content you want to put on your podcast. But there's a podcast to give a crash course on the type of content that's out there and how people present that content, and also some hints on how quality of content is important. There's a podcast by Dave Jackson, who produces a podcast called The School of Podcasting, which has been around for like 12 years, where you can learn a lot more than what you may learn here in regards to podcasting. So I definitely recommend you check that out. And the other piece is he does a podcast on iTunes, especially everywhere you can find my podcast, the Dependent Independent Podcast, called The Podcast Rodeo. And what he does is he gets podcasts, either a recommendation from Alexa, which is amazing when he does that, or people can go directly on his website and have them review his podcast or his or her podcast. And he does a first impression podcast. So they're about 7 to 8 minutes. The goal of it is to see how long you can hold on, hence the podcast rodeo. Either he gives a yay or nay at the end of his first impression. But talk about a crash course to really understand how people can take content, put good content out there and at a good high quality, because he definitely does first impressions on how good your mics sound. And we haven't talked about that yet on the show, but we're going to definitely include that on future shows. The difference between recording something on your phone, hence recording something on a professional microphone, if that's within your budget. But you can listen to his show, and it'll give you the fastest 7-minute lessons on what to do and what not to do when you decide to finally get on a microphone and record your podcast. And it's I've learned tons of things from that show. I highly recommend that show. I want to thank you for tuning in. Hey, Lou, I know this was a quick one, but please check out the Red Road Radio Show News. It's a podcast that posts everywhere where you can listen to this show and all our other podcasts in our podcast community. The UBU podcast with Meg and Liv is also another podcast I produce that you can find on iTunes as well. And you can find the hyperlinks in the show notes when we post this on YouTube on Friday. Feel free to tune in. I know I post this on my Facebook page. Hey, Liz, I post this. Let's see if we have other comments we want to pop down here. See, I love this guy. I love Lou. Lou makes me feel good, man. Lou, I love when you tune in because you make me feel wicked good. Let me pop this one out, and we'll do this right here. And this is great. I love this application. Boop. And if you haven't tried out my podcast or even checked it out, it's called the Dependent Independent Podcast. It posts every other Thursday at 9 a.m. So we have a brand new show, Show 83, with one of our co-hosts, Dana Rubin. My allergies, my eyes are itching. I'm sorry I can't hold that because this is full-blown live TV. And you can check that out. Make sure you subscribe to, and make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. That way, every time we post these shows, and we get these out probably about on Fridays, a little bit production we have to do to get it on YouTube. Takes about 2 days to get it out there because I have and that's one thing. We make podcasting easier because all of you have lives, and I have to make time, and which is amazing. This whole thing that I'm doing here allows me to figure out fast and easier ways to do it because I have to balance this, the live stream, my podcast production, and this little side hustle I'm starting here to help you make podcasting easier around my day job and my life. And that's exactly what you're going to get every time you tune in. So tune in next week. These shows post at 8 o'clock Eastern Time and 5 o'clock Pacific Time each and every Wednesday. But, and I mentioned this in the last show, I'm a dancing dad, and our practices start next week, so stay tuned on my Facebook page. And you're already on it because you're watching it. If not, follow me at Nick Goblish on Facebook, and we usually put the posting of the invites of these shows. There's my dog barking outside. Someone's got to let him in. So we're probably going to move the shows to either Tuesdays or Wednesdays, but I still want to make sure I give you quick tips to make your podcasting easier. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, all you guys who tuned in, Lou, Liz, Dana who's on the show, Anthony, thanks for joining, Anthony. And Liz, yes, this is the best podcast on the interwebs. Holy cow, why is my eye itching? Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for tuning in for this Facebook Live. And again, this show posts on YouTube. Thanks for watching this on YouTube. You have a great night. And guys, thank you for checking me out. Lou, thanks for your support. And I'm out.